Hello, my name is Linda Tzang, and on behalf of the New Westminster Museum Archives, I'd like to welcome you to this presentation, Great Museum Cities of the World, in honor of International. Before we begin, I'd like to start with the land acknowledgement on behalf of the City of New Westminster to recognize our existence on the unceded lands of the Pacific Northwest. Please take a moment to read our Okay, so in terms of our current understanding of museums really comes from a Western European tradition, which starts all the way with Francois I in France. So Francois I really initiates this idea of associating art with power. As a late medieval prince, he had actually suffered some pretty devastating political setbacks with the loss of the war, being held hostage. But while he was held hostage in Italy, or what we now know as Italy, he saw the wealth and the taste of the high Italian Renaissance. And he started associating this level of art with their political power. And so when he finally gets released and returns to France, he starts recreating that in France. And at the time, the royal residence was at Fontainebleau, which is just outside of Paris. And he basically takes a medieval fortress, pretty much demolishes it, and starts creating a high Italianate, high Renaissance palace. And as he now becomes more powerful and conquers more and more of France and Italy, he acquires art. And so this begins this association in France with art and political power. And this really is a continuity to understanding the place of the art museum in Paris and in French culture. So he rebuilds the Fontainebleau, hires great Italian artists, not the least of whom was Leonardo da Vinci. So in the final years of his life, Francois hires Leonardo da Vinci, installs him in Fontainebleau, and that is why the Mona Lisa is actually in Paris. It was one of the things that Leonardo brought with him to Fontainebleau. And when he passes away, it goes into the collection. So after investing all of this in Fontainebleau, he then looks at, well, what is the seat of political power in France? And that's Paris. Right, so the Louvre, again, was another existing royal residence. It started as a military fortress. And Francois begins to demolish that as well and starts another great building plan and creates the palace. And so this site then becomes really the focus of political and artistic power following Francois. So all the Valois dynasty start expanding the Louvre as a building and expanding the collection. Every time they conquer somewhere, every time they want to exert some level of their taste and their power, they acquire art. And they become great patrons of the art in order to control the narrative. It's also interesting that under the French system, all royal courtiers, so members of the court, are actually required to be in residence for a certain amount of time in the Louvre, at the palaces around the king. So even though their estates and their money come from the countryside, they are obligated by law to relocate to these seats of power. So that's the saturation, that's the concentration of political power and art, French system. Oops. Right. So this tradition continues, and it's very telling that when we get to the French Revolution, so there's a bit of a discontinuity under Louis the 14th, the Sun King, who relocates the court to Versailles. So the Louvre is effectively abandoned as a royal residence, but it still is a residence. And again, a place for artists. So there's an entire basement full of people living in the Louvre, essentially underneath an art museum. By the time we get to Louis XVI and the French Revolution, we know the story of the beheading of the royal court and the abandonment of this royal system during this period. But interestingly enough, the revolutionaries, one of their first acts is to transform the Louvre from a private residence / museum to a public museum. So they make the art in the Louvre available to the people. And that is a revolutionary act. So it's symbolic of the sharing of power, right? And that really cements this idea of art and power under the French system. The first legislatures under the revolution are actually held in the Louvre. And this continues into the present day, right? With successive, now democratically elected politicians still associating themselves with great art achievements. In the 1980s, right, the transformation of the Louvre. So the Louvre was still functioning, but a loose organization, and one wing of the Louvre used to house basic government ministries. In the 80s, the decision was made to reclaim the central courtyard of the Louvre, which at the time had become a very unsightly car park, and one of the wings. So to evict the bureaucrats out of the Louvre and make it a pure art museum. But somebody had to undertake this program. And they hired an international architect, I.M. Pei, and he is the one who created the Grand Louvre, as the project was called. And the Grand Louvre basically reorganized the entrance of the Louvre into the courtyard through the pyramid. And because they managed to evict everybody out of the wings, now the entire building could be open and you could have circulation through the entire building to view the art. So the Grand Louvre project, when it was first conceived, was highly critical, especially of the pyramid. But if we do the research, this idea of the pyramids at the center of the Louvre was actually first touted in the 17th century. 17th, 18th century. There were successive plans that that's what they were going to do with the courtyard. And today the courtyard is totally Instagram worthy and you can see it everywhere. And it is probably the most spectacular entrance into the Louvre, although there are shortcuts if you want to bypass the lines because the lines are crazy. So that's, so the Louvre really cements this idea of art and political power, art and power in France. The next sort of modern project is the Pompidou Center. So this is created under President Georges Pompidou, initiated in 1969, and finally opened to the public in 1977. Now, 68 was the time of the student riots in through France and particularly in Paris. So this was the idea, another revolution, a youth revolution, right? And so Georges Pompidou wanted a project that would reflect that. So the Pompidou Center at the time, the design was revolutionary. It turned the building inside out and put all the services, all the pipes on the outside to create a very clean gallery on the inside. And part of that was, this was going to house the modern art collection. Previously, there was no real home for the modern art collection, and it looked totally incongruous in the Louvre next to the old masters and all the things that had been looted over the centuries. So this was a clean, modern building for a clean, modern art, and especially was reflective of what had happened in Paris in the 1920s, when Paris was the center of modern art, the art of Picasso, Rock, all of that. So this was a fitting jewel for that new modern age. Then the next big project is the Musée d'Orsay. And the Musée d'Orsay was created under President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing in the 1980s. And this was not just a place to put the Impressionist collection, which was gaining popularity. It had actually been sort of overlooked previously by the French as not worthy of its own space. But it was also part of an economic revival. So this was the first repurposed major building. So it used to be the Gare d'Orsay, which was a railway station, and converted into a palace for Impressionist art. Then we get Musée de Quai Branly. Okay. Opens in 2006, instigated by Chirac, President Chirac. Interestingly, it was, even at its inception, sort of politically sensitive, right? It wanted to tell the colonial, imperialist history of France at a time when that wasn't an acceptable narrative. But they had all these collections, so they wanted to house it somewhere. So the museum actually went through a couple of iterations. It was at one point called the museum, going to be called the Museum of Primitive Peoples, the Museum of Other Peoples. It went through a couple of different iterations in order to find an acceptable narrative. The Musée Quai Branly it's actually named after the street. That was their compromise, was simply to name it after the street that it's located on. It is now, has been renamed again, the Musée Quai Branly Jacques Chirac. So they added the president's name to the end of this museum. Again, this association of politics, political power, and art and culture. And the latest iteration of this is under President Macron, who actually initiates the idea of repatriation, which had not previously been considered under other successive French governments. Because if you're associating power with art, how could you justify giving away power? Right. And what starts this is a discussion of the Benin bronzes, right, which are in European museums all over, and all of whom are known to have been looted. So President Macron agrees to repatriate these items in 2017. Unfortunately, right now, the process has been irrevocably stalled, despite the large press conference that you see. And it's stalled primarily because, well, with all these things, what does a repatriation policy look like? And they can't, the two houses, the two parliamentary houses can't agree what that looks like. So in theory, the government is committed to repatriation. In practice, they have failed to draft any legislation or policy in order to make that. So if Paris and France is a study of art and political power, then next slide, then you get a totally different story in London. So in London, in the UK, museums are a product of the Enlightenment. There are no, unlike other European collections, there are no royal collections in the public institutions of the great museums in London. The royal collection remains a separate thing and is under the ownership and the control of the royal family. Part of this is the legacy of Charles I, Charles I was probably the greatest art collector in European royal history, but with his beheading, his collection was dispersed. And so for the longest time, the British royal family did not actually invest in collection. And they never built up that same collection the way that Louis XIV and Francois did. So the British museums had to wait until the Enlightenment. So almost 300 to 400 years later than France. And part of the idea of the Enlightenment is education. But it's also universal, at least in theory. So universal enlightenment. So all of the major museums in the UK are actually started by private individuals who have agreed to donate their collections to the nation, donate or either have them purchased at a loss to the nation on the condition that these collections are made free and available to the public. These are all the conditions of these early donations, which is why today, if you go to London, it's probably the cheapest place to see great museums because most of them are free. And it's because of these original bequests. So the first one that starts the ball rolling is the British Museum. 1753, Sir Hans Sloane donates his collection. Well, he sells his collection at a loss to the nation on the understanding that it's freely accessible. Now that ends up being translated slightly differently in practice. When the museum finally does open quite a couple of decades later, there's moves and iterations of it. It is open, but it has limited opening hours. There is a ticket fee, and the ticket sellers and the guards have the right to vet people for quality. So sometimes you can get in, sometimes you can't, but at least people can get in. So the original collection of the British Museum is based on this Enlightenment concept of the Cabinet of Curiosities. So it's a mixture of natural history, objects, curiosities, things from other countries, and art, and most prominently old masters. The English at this time were not really collecting their own art. It wasn't considered quite good enough. So what they were collecting was art from the continent. So that's the foundation of the British Museum collection. We then, and part of the British Museum collection also housed the British Library. So this was, again, a supposedly publicly accessible library. It was certainly a free library in terms of everybody, once you got in, anybody had access to the books. Located originally in the courtyard of the British Museum in the round reading room. Some of the notable readers in the British Library, Karl Marx. And the British Library now operates on a system where basically any book published in English in the UK or the Commonwealth is supposed to post a copy to the British Library. So it is the largest repository of books in English. And what you see is a picture of the original round reading room and the current state of the British Library, which is a huge complex down the street now from the British Museum. The majority of books are actually located off-site, as you can imagine, millions and millions of copies of books. And there's a special train. So there's a train that brings books between the two sites. So if you're a reader at the British Library and you request a book, you turn it into the librarians and you return the next day, and that book has been brought by the special train to the library, and sometimes even delivered to the desk that you're sitting at. And while you're in use at the library and you're in use of those books, they will hold them for you until you say, I'm finished. And then they return them back to the offsite storage. It's quite a process. But having said that, once you get your British Library card, you have it for life. They cannot resend it. So somewhere I have a British Library card and I could go in and request a random book and they will bring it to my desk. But you have to read it there, and security is quite tight. And they're very adamant about their security. So that's the little aside on the British Library. But again, this falls into this idea of all of these organizations are a product of the Enlightenment, the belief in education as edifying, and that is how education will lift up the country. The Natural History Museum is actually a division of the original Soane bequest. So as the organizations grow, it's decided that really these two collections, the two separate collections, need to be housed in different places. So the Natural History Museum spins off. And probably the most significant collection housed at the Natural History Museum is the Darwin collection. So when Charles Darwin dies, all of the specimens that he collected in the Galapagos and through the course of his life were donated to the Natural History Museum and are now housed in a specialist wing called the Darwin Wing. It's quite spectacular. You see all the collections in formaldehyde going like soaring into the ceiling, and you can have them spin and you can look at various things in jars of alcohol. The accession is the collection of preserved specimens is so huge that they have specialist tanks. So there are specialist tanks of at least 1,000, 2,000 gallons that are held offsite, that are piped into the museum specifically so researchers can preserve specimens. The Natural History Museum doesn't move to the South Kensington site until the 19th century. And it's actually not legally separated from the British Museum until 1963. So then we get the National Gallery. So we have sort of a universal museum. The British Museum is the first museum to espouse itself as a universal. Then it was decided, well, universal museum, but we need art. We need a specialist art museum. And the National Gallery is founded in 1824 after the nation purchases the picture collection of banker John Julius Angerstein. And again, he agrees to sell the collection at a loss to the nation on condition of having a purpose-built museum and open to the public. This collection is quickly joined by paintings from Sir George Beaumont. So when you get collections that are collected by private individuals, they're very much a reflection of a more egalitarian taste than a royal collection. Right? Royal collections are heavily populated by portraits of themselves and their family. These kind of collections are less so. Right? Beaumont was a member of the Royal Academy, and so he collected landscapes. So this is the origin of sort of that landscape tradition in British museums. So then we go to this. This is a little anomaly. So the John Soane Museum. So Sir John Soane was an architect, the leading architect of his age. And he actually started out as the son of a bricklayer. So he was heavily invested and understood the value of education and how education lifts you from your humble origins to the most exalted. You know, so the son of bricklayer is literally rubbing shoulders with royalty because he's building their grand homes, building. John Soane starts his collection when he is awarded a scholarship by the king, King George III. And he takes a grand tour, and so like most young men on the grand tour, he starts collecting. He purchases a townhouse in London. And when he becomes a professor at the Royal Academy for Architecture, he then opens his house as sort of a teaching research area. And as he collects more and more, he purchased the house next door. And then the house next door. And he knocks the three townhouses together in order to build his grand museum. So the John Soane Museum. The John Soane Museum is highly eclectic, jam-packed with artifacts. And you might look at it as sort of a high-end hoarders. On first glance, that's what it looks like, a very high-end hoarders building. But John Soane was incredibly invested in the scientific understanding of his collection. So all the things in his museum are organized according to his understanding and his method of understanding the universe and the place of art, antiquities, and all these things in the universe. So when he dies, the museum is bequeathed to the nation on the condition that it's open to the public, it's free, and they can't move anything. They have to preserve it exactly how he left it when he died. And to this day, that building stands exactly how those collections stand exactly how he left them when he died. One of the interesting things is he obviously ran out of space. So there's a whole collection, a collection of allegorical paintings by William Hogarth, who at this time, in John Soane's lifetime, was considered one of the premier artists of the period. So it's a series of 12 allegorical paintings. And you have to see them in a row to understand the story. Well, he doesn't have wall space to see them in a row. So if you look at the top picture, this is his solution. So it's a series of panels that open. And when you open them, you can read the story. So it's an early comic book, if you will, but preserved exactly as he left. So now we come to the Victoria and Albert Museum. So the Victoria and Albert Museum is a legacy of the Great Exhibition of 1851, which is the pet project or the project of Prince Albert, consort to Queen Victoria. It was the very first international exhibition of its time, and it was designed to show off the very best in British manufacturing. And British at this point encompasses the empire. So this was not only to show the strength of the empire, but the quality of the objects created during the Industrial Revolution. This is Great Britain at its manufacturing height. The Great Exhibition ends up being an incredible success, and they take the actual profits from the exhibition and decide to plow it into a museum, a legacy. So they're looking at all the best objects that were supplied to the Great Exhibition, and make the decision to house them into a lasting museum. And the idea, of course, being this way, other artisans can come and learn and be the best at what they do by looking at the best that's ever been produced. So it takes a while for this museum, right? The Great Exhibition is 1851, and the museum proper isn't actually finished until 1909. But one of the things that happens with this particular museum is the founding of Museum Row in South Kensington. So they actually purchase the land there, decide to place this museum there, continually expand it. Once they get to a certain point, the Natural History Museum is also moved to this site. So this becomes Museum Central in London. The very first director of the V&A is Henry Cole, who was Albert's right-hand man during the Great Exhibition. So they really continue this legacy. Tellingly, it is also the very first museum in the world to have a refreshment room. And a very fancy one, because that's that room at the top right is the refreshment room. Beautifully tiled. For a while, it sort of, the museum had closed it, used it for exhibition spaces, but now it's been refurbished and you can actually still eat there. They've reopened it as a cafe. It is the nicest, fanciest cafe in a museum you will ever imagine. And it's great. You know, and one of the things is the cast room, right? So the plaster casts, right? So these are great monuments, great pieces of art from all over Europe that are gathered in one room so that people could come and learn from them. These are full-size casts of these original pieces of art. Then we get to National Portrait Gallery, and this continues the thought of the V&A, right? So we've learned the best of manufacturing. Now let's learn the best of Britain. And that's represented by, quote, the great and the good. Right? So we will have portraits. It's not the quality of the portraits, it's who they represent. It's an encyclopedia of notable people in British history. The very first portrait that they acquire is the one of Shakespeare. Interestingly, the very first portrait of a woman they acquire is, I believe, either Nell Gwyn, who was the mistress of Charles II, or Wellington's, the Duke of Wellington's. So, of course, they weren't selected. The two women weren't selected for being good. Their selection was based on being beautiful. And this is a trend that the National Portrait Gallery is now currently trying to readdress. Right? They're trying to find portraits of women for their accomplishments and increasing their complement of women artists within the collection. The National Portrait Gallery has just reopened this past year after a new refurbishment, which again increases their exhibit space in order to accommodate this ongoing story. Out of all the national museums in the UK, they're probably the most actively collecting because they have to constantly collect the great and the good. And sometimes the infamous and sometimes just the famous. And, you know, so that is expanding. The topic of who they, the definition of who they collect is expanding every day as society redefines who they want to honor. Then we come to the Tate. So in 1889, industrialist Henry Tate offers his collection to the nation. And he even offers to foot the bill to build the new building as opposed to previous benefactors. One of the reasons is Henry Tate believed that the National Gallery didn't have enough Britishness, right? They were primarily concerned with collecting old masters. So they were collecting good art, not necessarily British art. And he wanted to elevate British art into this realm of good and great art. That's what he was going to support. So in 1897, the National Gallery of British Art is opened, now commonly known as the Tate. So the collection in the National Gallery that relates to that is produced by British artists is moved into this new site. And a large part of this collection is the Turner bequest. So John Turner, probably the preeminent landscape painter in British art. When he died, his collection was bequeathed to the nation and had been sort of housed in a basement at the National Gallery, and now has an entire wing at the Tate. And since then, the Tate Britain has also been separated into the Tate Britain and the Tate Modern. So the Tate Modern is probably the newest organization. It's in a repurposed brutalist industrial building. It was a power station. And one of the great things about the Tate Modern is the turbine hall. So this big, huge, 6-story gallery that runs through the spine of this building where the great turbine engines used to sit is now used to populate with really contemporary large-scale installation. Some of the most famous, the Heller Sun. So an artist, Norwegian, I believe he's Norwegian, Scandinavian artist, installed a sun into the gallery. And you could actually, when we went, people were actually lying down on the floor of the turbine hall as if they were lying on a beach and getting a suntan, which they were not. Ai Weiwei also did an installation here with millions of ceramic sunflower seeds that you were supposed to be able to walk through and feel that. Unfortunately, for health and safety reasons, they had to cordon it off because they were afraid of all the dust that was coming up. So it didn't quite have the impact of the installation that we wanted. But it is one of the few modern galleries that can house these huge scale installations. And so it's become known for that. This particular installation is one of the newest ones. This one dates from 2019. Kara Walker is an American artist. And this particular fountain, if you take a close look at it, is actually comprised of caricatures from the colonial past. Right? So she has this particular, the figures on this fountain are African Americans, African slaves. And it's a commentary on what we honor, especially in a place like the Tate Modern. Right. Originally intended as a one-off temporary installation, it's now traveling and trying to find a permanent home. People have really resonated with it. So it's really, in Britain, it's about enlightenment and education. So we have Paris, which is art and power, of enlightenment and education. Now we move to New York. And New York is about money. There's no other way to say it. It's about money. So the great institutions of New York were all sort of founded by robber barons, as they were known at the time. And these were people who had made their money through industrial investments in New York, in America. And they were now trying to buy legitimacy and prestige through museums and other means, right? They were inventing themselves as a new elite and borrowing from the conventions in Europe. That elitism is expressed through art. But the entry to all of these institutions is money. How much can you contribute to this organization? And how much meaning dollars, not your time, not anything, how much money. So all the boards of all of these large institutions in New York are actually expected to donate millions of dollars, host fundraisers, purchase things on behalf of the museum, and bequeath things to the museum. That is the price of legitimacy in New York. So the Metropolitan Museum is probably the granddaddy of all of these institutions. 1866, it's actually initiated by a group of Paris-based socialites, right? And it's financed by wealthy New Yorkers. So you can see that influence of the Louvre and those great salons in the Metropolitan Museum. And they fully expected to create a national institution and gallery of art. And so they incorporated in 1870. They started with antiquities and old masters and benefited by the instability in Europe. The wars in Europe. Oh, that meant they could buy things from fleeing aristocrats, collapse of nations, collapse of governments. So they bought up Europe and shipped it across the ocean to New York. And so in 1880, the Met moves to its Fifth Avenue location. And this is the beginning of the Museum Mile, as it's known in New York. So you can actually literally go a mile along Fifth Avenue at the north end of Fifth Avenue in New York and just go from museum to museum to museum. And you want, the prestige is to be on or near the Museum Mile. You can have other museums, but they don't have the same prestige. Following with this idea of the directors and the trustees wanting to donate, if you go through the Met, you can see the Robert Lehman wing. Robert Lehman, investor, banker. The Michael C. Rockefeller wing. The Lila Acheson Wallace wing. Henry R. Kravis wing. So all of these are former directors of the Met who have donated significant collections and money to house these collections in this museum. Probably the biggest expression is the Met Cloisters. So the Met Cloisters is off-site. And John D. Rockefeller and J. Pierpont Morgan donated land and money to reconstruct part of a medieval cloister that they actually purchased and had shipped over to New York to build a museum dedicated to medieval art. So then we go to probably a little bit of an anomaly is this Museum of Natural History. But this proposal to create a natural history wing is supported by, quote, the merchant prince of Wall Street, William E. Dodge, and Theodore Roosevelt Sr., so the father of the president-to-be. And the money invested in this is to sort of mimic those royal patronages. So what they're doing is they're funding expeditions. They're exploring and settling the American flag around the world and then shipping those collections back to New York. So it's a sort of imperialism by money. Now the Frick collection is a very interesting case. So Henry Clay Frick built his fortune in coal and steel. But he's from a wealthy Pennsylvania family, not New York. Though they're very cliquey and very snobbish at this time. So after making his fortune, he relocates to New York, and he sat on a lot of corporate boards, but they refused him entry into any of the museum boards. That was sort of reserved for their social elite, and Frick was not one of them. So Frick decided to flex his muscles, flex his financial muscles. So if you're not going to let me on your boards, I'm going to build my own museum. So he purchased a mansion on Museum Row, had it retrofitted to house his collection. And Frick had a very interesting idea. Frick didn't amass a huge collection. What he did was he got his advisors to tell him who was the best. Give me a list of the best European painters, best old masters, best of everything. and he acquired one, or he acquired the best that he could from those people, right? So he only has one Titian in the collection, but it's the best Titian. One El Greco, but it's the best El Greco, right? One Sargent, but it's the most, it's the most sought after Sargent. So he basically built his collection as a little bit of, a backhander to all the people who would not let him on the other boards. And he, after his death, he left an endowment for acquisitions and for maintenance of the building. The museum opened to the public in 1935. Right now, the Frick is engaged in a bit of a battle with this New York elite. It's still considered an outlier, despite the fact that it's been there for a long time. They need to build an extension because the Frick has continued to acquire. And so the idea is where that little garden is, they want to put some kind of extension tower, and they're not having it. So they've been embroiled in this particular debate now for at least probably 10 years about how to expand the Frick. Then we move to the Museum of Modern Art. And it's founded in 1929 by a new generation of the New York elite. Again, it's the same impetus as those who founded the Met, right? But this is a group who want to show their modernity. They're in a new age. They've made their money in this new age. They're not industrialists anymore. They're financiers. So that is the cornerstone of the Modern Art Museum, Museum of Modern Art. And tellingly, again, they are not on the Museum Mile. They're close to it, but they're not on it. They wanted a separate identity and very distinct. One thing that they did benefit from was World War II. And with the German opposition to degenerate art, they were able to substantially add to the collections by buying those pieces of art at a time where the industrialists, the artistic elite in Europe had to get out and were divesting themselves of their collection, finance their escape. Then we go to the final piece is the Guggenheim. So the Guggenheim, the family fortune was made in mining in the 1800s. But by World War I, they're no longer actively engaged in those fields, but they have amassed enough money that they are known for their philanthropy. They amassed enough money for the next generations. All they do is manage how they're going to give away their fortune. And then it's helped that Guggenheim married a Rothschild. So two of the great fortunes of the late 19th, earliest 20th century are amalgamated into, and they pour their money into these institutions. It originally opens as the Museum of Non-Objective Painting in 1939. And they are showing modern and contemporary art collected by Solomon Guggenheim, who actually doesn't begin collecting modern art until he's 66. So he comes to this late, but with a lot of money and a lot of time. So it is one of the premier collections in the museum. They're in a sort of a standard 19th century building, but they decide that they need a facility that's the proper backdrop to this new modern art. So they commission Frank Lloyd Wright to make a building that is reflective of what the content is. So the iconic Guggenheim building opens in 1959. It's an engineering feat. The reason for the delay between commissioning and opening is how difficult it was to build that sort of snail shell and the ramps going through it. Frank Lloyd Wright, I believe, passed away before this building was completed because it was that difficult to build. But the minute it was built, every single magazine, every single person with a camera who's gone to New York has taken a picture of this building, inside or out. And this is something that the Guggenheim has continued. Right? The Guggenheim brand of museums has expanded internationally. And on each site, their desire is to commission these iconic buildings. The exception is the Guggenheim Venice, and that's Peggy Guggenheim's Palazzo. So she lived there with her art until she donated it to the foundation. So in keeping with this tradition of commissioning great architects and creating iconic buildings, the Guggenheim is now heavily associated with Frank Gehry. And one of the big project that Frank Gehry did for them was Guggenheim Bilbao. And at the time, Bilbao was an incredible risk. Bilbao was a depressed northern city in Spain that had been based on shipbuilding. And by the time Guggenheim Bilbao was proposed, that industry was gone. So it was just a depressed, abandoned industrial city. And Bilbao has since rebuilt the entire economy of that city because people were so drawn to that building. It's referred to as the Bilbao effect. This idea that you can have an iconic building, an iconic institution, and that will revive the economics of the city. There's been many attempts now to duplicate it. Okay. There's proposed for a Guggenheim Abu Dhabi. But there's been no real evidence that that's a duplicable event. So Paris is about art and power. London is about enlightenment and education. And New York is about money. And the reason we tell you this is that if you're visiting these cities and visiting these iconic museums, hopefully this will give you an insight as to why these collections exist in these institutions and have you come to a better understanding of why and how they're exhibited in these cities. So thank you very much.